So we are very pleased to have today with us Dr. Amit Yashar from the Department of Special Education in the University of Haifa. Amit did his BA in psychology at the Academic College of Tel Aviv, in Jaffa. And then he continued to do a master's and a PhD degree in psychology at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Professor Dominique Lamy. He then continued to do a postdoc at Professor Marisa Carrasco's lab at NYU. Following his postdoc, he joined the University of Haifa as faculty in the Department of Special Education and the Edmond J. Safra Brain Research Center for the Study of Learning Disabilities. He heads the Yashar lab, investigating visual attention and cognition. In his research, he investigates visual perception and cognition, focusing on the processes that determine how people detect and identify visual features and objects. The research goal is to understand how cognitive and brain capacities such as plasticity, attention, and memory can enhance visual perception in both typical and atypical populations, such as in people with autism, visual impairments, or learning disabilities. Amit's research uses a variety of research methods, including psychophysics, eye tracking, and computational modeling. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Amit, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Sharon, for inviting me, and thank you for everybody here. And yeah, so I did my postdoc and PhD studies in more basic science and attention and visual perception. And moving into the special education department at the Haifa University, it gave me the great opportunity for me to translate that research into special populations. And one of the main population that we study here is ASD, autistic individuals, which attract a lot of attention from many reasons. Of course, beside the clinical importance and the prevalence of the condition, there's also an intellectual interest in understanding autism. There's something fundamental different in this condition, and therefore there's something that is more beyond just the clinical relevancy. Autism is mostly associated with the communicational, high-level cognition, social behavior difficulties, but in fact, sensory processing and perception is considered to be a core phenotype of the phenomenon, and also is part of the diagnostic criteria in DSM-5. You can see on the right, this is the number of articles that have autism and sensory or perception in the title or the abstract. And so you can see the increase in that topic over the last several years. Why is it important to study perception in autism? First of all, it can be an early marker, an early biomarker of the condition. It can also explain the development of later, like more higher difficulties. For example, perception and sensory processing can explain later maybe the inability to or the difficulty to understand facial expression, for example. And it's also have the opportunity to give us insight into the core underlying neural mechanism, because relatively to other functions, perception we know well in terms of the mechanism in the brain. So we recently we had a review in the annual review of visual neuroscience together with the Bachi Haddad, and we try to understand more the kind of give more sense to the literature around the perception in autism, and we're focusing on two two main open questions. One is, first of all, the characterization of those alterations in autism are not well understood and not clear, and we don't know exactly what different. And also, whether there is a single mechanism, a single model that can explain those different alterations. We can point to a few main differences, and we know there is a superiority in some functions like visual search, and low level features or tasks like pitch discrimination. So ASD are better in those tasks, or it was reported they are better in those tasks. On the other hand, more complex or more higher level stimuli like facial expression or facial recognition. There are some reports of global motion, so they are worse in those kind of tasks, but still there are some mixed results regarding that as well. One of the well-known characteristic of autism perception is reduced susceptibility to illusion, which was reported back in the 90s, but yet even that more recent work with more rigorous measurement of visual illusion show that actually they can be susceptible as well as neurotypicals. I think the kind of the variety of alterations and the fact that they are not consistent and can be and sometimes they have hypersensitivity and sometimes they have hypersensitivity. And as well as the illusions led to motivated recently accounts for the alteration perception in autism using the Bayesian framework and predictive coding. Those are two well-established models of perception in general, and they attempt to explain alteration in autism is due to enhance weight over the sensory information that can be done in a different ways or mechanism, but the overall outcome of those models is that the ASD percept is give more weights over to the sensory information over prior knowledge. So in Bayesian perception, we integrate prior expectation with sensory information. And according to this view, individuals on the spectrum rely less on those prior expectations, and more on sensory evidence. And this is perhaps why they also are less susceptible to illusions, for example. Surprisingly, there is no direct and systematic investigation of the unbalanced hypothesis of ASD perception. So in this talk, I will focus on two studies that try to investigate that. The first one will directly test the integration process of the Bayesian components. And in the second study, I will investigate the forming of prior knowledge. Prior knowledge is formed through experience, and so we want to, so this study actually trying to understand whether this is the deficit is actually not in the integration itself, but actually more in the learning process. So the first study is led by Lorena Fazielli. She's a PhD student in my lab and in Batshi Haddad lab, and it's also with collaboration with Rachel Dennison from Boston University, who has a lot of experience with Bayesian's inference models. And we took the approach of testing that directly in the decision-making and in confidence report, and using signal detection theory framework. So signal detection theory is basically particular case of Bayesian inference. So in this model, we have a signal that it can have a certain strength, and we have distributions of the probability of either noise or signal. And we can also relate to that as either stimulus 1 or stimulus 2 if the task is not to detect, rather to discriminate between two types of stimuli. So the strength of the stimuli can determine the probability or the likelihood that that stimuli belong to either one of the the signal belong to either one of those stimuli. And this probability is called the likelihood function. And in Bayesian inference, we integrate that probability with the prior information. And that prior information, in this case, when you have two categories, in this case, it's balance. And so our decision criteria will be in the middle. But for example, if we have some reason to believe that category 1 is more likely, then or stimulus 1, sorry, is more likely, then we can shift our criteria in favor of stimulus 1 or vice versa. And in addition to prior, there is also expected cost. So if, for example, we think that category 1 will be more costly to miss that or to incorrectly not detect it, then we want to move our criteria in favor of that category or that stimuli. So using this approach, we conducted 3 experiments. Each one aimed to investigate one of the 3 components. The first one, the integration of prior. The second one, the cost, the expected cost. And the last one, the likelihood. And we conducted that on 2 groups of participants, and an autistic group and a non-autistic group. The task was a categorization task of orientation. So there was a gabor appearing in the middle, and it can be oriented either clockwise or counterclockwise from horizontal. The orientation varied continuously, but it was sampled out of 2 categories distributions. One of more clockwise and the other one counterclockwise. So the category A is counterclockwise, category B is clockwise. The category were overlapping. So in this area, for example, around the horizontal, then it could be in either categories, and therefore the overall maximum performance could be reached only up to 80% correct. We had observer performing a single report of the categories. So the reported the categories and the confidence rating using a single key pressed. And we vary the contrast sensitivity to manipulate the sensory uncertainty. So this is basically built on and Denison and et al. 2019 and 18 and from Wejima lab. And but here to test the effect of prior, we added blocks with various base rate of the categories. So in the first block, the category A had 25%. In the second block, it was balanced between the categories, 50-50. And then in the last block, it was 75% for category A. So observer were told to that those base rate in advance. And so we wanted to make sure that they actually understand that one category has higher probability than the other one. So we want to cancel any effect of learning or implicit learning. And in order to check for this manipulation, we also asked the observer prompt a question during the experiment every random number of trial. asked them to gamble on one of those categories, sorry. And we found that indeed both groups gambled in the same level, indicating that both groups understand the manipulation or the base rate manipulation in the same way. This is also done in the following experiment. This is particularly important when we're dealing with a population that is having communication difficulties, and just to make sure that they understand exactly. And any difference that we find is not due to lack of understanding. These are the raw results. On the x-axis, it's the orientation. On the y-axis is the probability of reporting category B. And you can see that the probability increase as with the when the orientation become more and more clockwise from horizontal. The different lines represent the prior blocks. And so we see a clear effect of prior in both groups. So on the left, it's the autistic group. On the right is the non-autistic group. Both show very similar pattern of results, and both for the orientation itself and the manipulation of the prior. So they perform the task very similar, and then we look at D prime. And here it shows, we see a little bit better, higher performance for the non-autistic group for the sensitivity. So this is the sensitivity as a function of contrast. There's a little bit more, a little bit higher D prime for the non-autistic group. And when we look at the criterion shift for each block separately, we see that the shift is higher for lower contrast, which makes sense, because when you have increased sensory uncertainty, you rely more on your prior. That also can be modeled using an optimal observer. Overall, the patterns look the same, but there's a little bit of higher shift for the ASD population. But that higher shift could be due to the lower D prime. So in order to test that, we compare those results to an optimal observer. And by doing that, we were able to cancel any difference in performance level on criterion shift. And now when we do that, there is no difference between the groups. The lines are basically overlapping, indicating that that overall, when a prior is explicitly told, they can perform integration of prior knowledge to the same extent as neurotypicals. And they shift the criteria according to the prior information in a suboptimal, but in a typical manner as non-autistic. So next we wanted to see, okay, whether this is also true regarding the expected cost. And so we perform the same task, but now instead of manipulating the prior, we manipulated the expected cost. So one category got more points than the other category. So so in one block, category A got more points than category B. And in the last block, category B got more points than category A. Again, we checked whether they can understand the point that they going to receive for each category. And we find that both groups understand it to the same extent, no different there. Raw data, again, very similar pattern of results between the groups, and very similar to experiment 1. Both perform the task well. The D prime, now, this is interesting. We think this is because we gave them points and they were rewarded for those points later with cash, then that increased motivation. And so we now see that the ASD group with the higher motivation perform the task as well as the non-autistic group. And we look at the shift of criterion, quite similar. And now, because the D prime is the same, is also the shift of criteria, the delta shift of criteria is also the same between the groups. And of course, when we calculate deviation from optimal observer, both groups deviate the same from optimal observer. So both in as a response to reward and as a response to prior expectation, ASD are performing this integration of those information to the same extent. Now, the next question was about the sensory uncertainty. And here, it's a bit tricky because we want to test sensory uncertainty alone, not with integration to reward or expected cost. Sorry, with the prior or expected cost. And to do that, we cannot use the traditional categorization task. Because this type of task, a regular D prime, doesn't allow us to distinguish between various scenarios where there is an increase in the standard deviation of the Gaussian and also shift of the mean. So to deal with that and following papers by Adler and Ma, and we use the embedded task in which instead of one category is next to the other, category A is embedded in category B. So as you see in the bottom, so overall, the stimulus was the same and the response pattern was the same, except that now they have to respond whether the category, whether the orientation was belong to the category A in the middle and the category B on the side. This task looks a little bit weird, but it also, you can think about it, this also can be, there's a real world example for a situation when we have to classify between a narrow group inside a larger group. For example, you want to classify a dog within a group of animals, for example, or mammals. Okay, so category A is more a narrow range, and category B is a larger range, and they had to perform it. And the idea is that if we increase sensory uncertainty, then it will, if you adjust your decision criteria, you should, your decision boundary will be shifted to the side more. And when sensory uncertainty is larger, as the case in the on the bottom at the 2, because for here we reduce the contrast. So basically, we're looking to see whether they shift the decision criteria as a function of contrast sensitivity, contrast. So these are the raw results, and you see the function of reporting category B as a function of orientation, and you have this shape because of this embedded task. So in the middle, they're mostly reporting category A. But you can see that here they have an example of free contrast. When it's the lower contrast, they actually tend to report category A even more on the extreme orientations. Okay, so we can calculate the sensitivity here, which is basically the inverse of the sensitivity, and which can be equivalent to the D prime. And we see that the pattern of result is very similar across the groups. So this is as a function of contrast. And in the middle, we calculated the shift of the decision boundary. And again, we see it's very similar. And on the right, we compare the results to optimal observer. And the results seems to be similar. And there is a little bit of difference, but it's not significant. So overall, our results show that in both type of manipulation, whether it's manipulating prior, manipulating expected cost, or manipulating the likelihood itself, individual on the spectrum can adjust the criteria in a very typical way, indicating that prior integration in ASD can be intact, and then basically they can perform this integration in a very similar way to non-autistic populations. All right. So we see that in terms of the decision-making process and integration of Bayesian components, they can perform that contrary to the prevailing view. They actually can perform that in a typical way. So what may be altered? So we did find some indication for alteration when we look at the confidence rating. So as you remember, in addition for reporting the stimulus category, they also reported a confidence rating from high to mid-high, from mid-low, and then low. So 4 levels of confidence rating. And initial analysis of confidence rating show that their performance level is actually, so that the performance level of ASD actually correlates better with confidence rating compared to non-autistic population. So, and that occurs mainly in the expected cost experiment, experiment 2 and experiment 3 with the likelihood. And so you can see that they have higher performance when the confidence is high, and they have lower performance than non-typical when their confidence is low.
Amit, can I ask
Yes,
a question?
sure.
Did you collapse here for each participant, all the contrast levels and everything, just by the confidence rating that they gave for each trial?
Yeah, in this case, we collapse across all
Okay.
contrast level.
Okay, and is there any interaction between the contrast level and the confidence, or is it similar? I mean, I assume that higher contrast would lead to higher confidence rating, but I
Right.
wonder, so I'm just...
It's a good question. We still analyzing those results, and we're basically doing a model fitting now to understand more the results. Generally speaking, we didn't see particular interaction with confidence with contrast level.
Okay.
But obviously there are more trials when they have low confidence and low accuracy in low contrast.
Okay, thank you.
We didn't find the same pattern of results when we manipulated prior, and there could be some reason for that. Maybe one reason is that when you perform confidence judgment, you rely on 2 components. One is the sensory uncertainty, and the other one is the prior. And in the expected cost experiment, in the second experiment, and the third experiment, they were only relying on sensory uncertainty, but in the other one, they actually also had to rely on prior. So perhaps something about that lead to that. Another possible explanation is that in both the expected cost experiment and the sensory uncertainty experiment, we had a monetary compensation to increase motivation, because we saw that actually helps them. So that also maybe had to a higher motivation, and this is why they are also performing the confidence better. Nonetheless, it does show that they can perform confidence rating similar to neurotypical, and even better in some conditions, and still need to be investigated. So these are a little bit surprising results, but it indication that in terms of metacognition, that perhaps they have enhanced metacognitive judgment of their own perception. In study 2, we investigated. So we saw in study 1 that the ability to integrate those three components is intact. And in study 2, we want to see, okay, so maybe they integrate that component well, or typically, but maybe the problem is then when they need to form a prior. And so this study was done by Zinab Naharan, who's a PhD student in my lab. And so we know that in general, people can learn the statistics of the environment. They can form knowledge about the regularities of stimulus, and they can do it implicitly, and they can do it fast. So I wanted to test whether they can, how well they can do it, and whether they are sensitive to the distribution of stimuli. And whether there are differences in the nuance of learning those distribution between ASD and neurotypical. We used a visual search task, so our observer had to search for a color, a singleton color target, and to report whether the chop side was on the left or on the right. So the color, what defined the targets and what defined the response are two different features. Was briefly presented, and then it was masked. So we measure accuracy as dependent variable, and observer had to report whether it was chopped on the left or chopped on the right. We basically manipulated the distribution of target color. So target color can be sampled out of 5 different colors in a color wheel, in a DKL color wheel. We used a uniform colors in one condition, a uniform, distribution of colors in one condition. And in another experiment, we used some similar to Gaussian distribution, where the color in the middle had a higher probability than the colors on the side, and the probability is gradually reduced. So the color in the middle has also been shown more. We kept performance level the same across group by using a staircase and measuring the threshold for 80% correct ISI between the stimulus and the mask to keep performance level across groups. Well, I'll show first the Gaussian distribution. And the Gaussian distribution, we can see that both groups learn the prior effect. So there's no interaction between them. There's a main effect of the distance between the target color and the mean color of the distribution. So 0 mean it was the same, the target color was the same as the mean. And then 6, it was different by 6 colors or 6 GNDs. And 12 was the farthest away, and both groups show this similar pattern, even though there is a main effect for the non-autistic group, which was a little bit better in that task. The interesting finding was that for the uniform distribution, the non-autistic group show higher performance for the mean color, even though that color was not shown more, was similar, had similar probabilities as other colors. It just was in the middle of that uniform distribution. Nonetheless, they show higher performance for that color, whereas the autistic group did not show higher performance for the color in the middle. So this is an interesting indication that perhaps there's something in the nuance in the way they learn and the mean of the probabilities. they can learn the mean of the probabilities, but it's more sensitive to the distribution. And in some way, it's actually the autistic group performed the task in a sense, didn't learn what, didn't create a mean when there was no reason to create a mean, because in a uniform distribution, there's no reason for the mean to cause a higher performance compared to the Gaussian. So I'll summarize overall the results here. So we see that when it comes to Bayesian inference process and integration, typical and ASD performed that in a typical manner. We do see some indication for atypical enhanced confidence or metacognitive judgment of their perception. And perhaps there is differences in the ability to learn the statistics of the regularity, in a sense that actually, in both cases, they're a little bit better. So they, with both, maybe more, they have enhanced metacognitive ability on the one hand, in some way, and the way that they're learning the probability of the environment is more sensitive actually to the probability than non-autistic, which creates some kind of a bias towards the mean regardless of the distribution. That's it for this talk, and I'd like to thank Lorena Faziali and Zinab for leading that, and also Bachi Haddad and Rachel Dennison and the rest of the people in Yashar Lab, and the Spark Center, which is the center that we are running here in our department for special populations, which integrate the community with our department, and this is also our way to get a lot of participants. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amit, for a really interesting talk. And I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself and give Amit a big applaud. And I also want, is it okay if we open the floor for questions?
Sure.
Okay. So yes, everybody's welcome to ask questions, and I will begin. As I see. So I have actually a few questions. I'll start. First of all, are there any is there anything known about the difference between autistics and neurotypicals with respect to the contrast sensitivity function? I mean, you did modulate contrast, and I wonder if there's any shift or anything with respect to that. And in the same line of question, I want to ask if there's any indication relative to the color. So, for example, retinal structure. Is retinal structure such as cones, distribution, or even subtypes of cones, is it the same? I mean, are there any known, has this been looked into, whether autistics have the same distribution of cones and rods and subtypes of cones? Yeah, these are my questions with respect to sensory, to the sensory aspect you're looking for.
So there are some reports that have better basic fundamental discrimination of features. We didn't find anything like that in our study. And we showed that actually our abilities are very similar to non-autistic population in discriminating orientations. And we conduct other studies, and we didn't find enhancement in these regards. Regarding the color, I actually don't know about the distribution of cones. We did measure color blindness, and we make sure that everybody that performed task doesn't have any color blindness issues. So that was one screening that we did, use that book for color vision. But whether they have distribution of cones, that's a good point, actually. I will check that in the literature if there's anything indication about that.
Okay, thank you. And I want to ask about the first question. Oh, sorry, Mirav, you want to go? So I'll continue later.
Hi, I have a very basic question. I guess I misunderstood something basic. And this is in the first experiment, what determines category A versus category B? How are they different from the perspective of the viewer? I mean, you have a distribution and then another distribution.
Yeah.
So let's look at the intermediate of key horizontal stimulus. What makes it belong to category B or category A?
Good point. So the horizontal one can be 50% of the time category A or 50% of the time category B. And as you go counterclockwise, it will be more likely category A. And as you go...
But what determines it as category A or B is your own internal perspective as an experimenter. What I don't understand, what should the viewer do? I mean, I'm a perfect viewer. I see something horizontal. For me, what makes it category B or category A? I have no noise. What?
For you as a
perfect viewer, zero noise.
As a perfect viewer, will be 50 correct for the horizontal.
What?
You will have no idea if it's belong to the category A or category B, because you know the probability that it belongs to either one of those categories. But
the task is to guess. But my task as a viewer is to guess what you had in mind when you presented the stimuli. I'm not sure I understand what participants' task is actually.
Okay, so we actually show them the distribution and we explain the probability based on the orientation that the stimulus belong to either one of those categories. So they learn that if they understand the idea, okay, so the idea is that, maybe I didn't explain that enough. So the idea is that they learn that those orientation, they have to understand that those orientation are coming from distributions. They don't just discrimination of orientation. They have to understand that those are coming from a distribution. And so they have to understand actually the idea that there is a probability here, and that this is more probably coming from category A, and this is more probably coming from category B, and this can be either from category A and category B. So there is...
The stimuli on the extreme, it's obvious. It's not about guessing because this is defined as category B. But those in the middle, why is there a correct or incorrect answer to begin with? I don't understand, because this is what you think as an experimenter. I don't see there is any dependence on the visual properties. So I fail to understand. I mean, usually in signal detection theory, the whole idea is that there is a fixed stimulus and the distribution is because the system has some noise in its representation. But what you're doing is presenting different stimuli, and in the middle you have a stimulus. I correctly identify it as horizontal, but why should it be category A versus category B? As far as a perfect viewer, a viewer that has no noise, sees everything, why should it be category A? I still fail to understand that.
So the idea is that the decision. So there is not only uncertainty at the level of the sensor information, there is also inherent uncertainty here at the level of the decision making.
But what makes a decision right? What you had in mind as an experimenter?
What makes the decision right?
Yes.
What in this case, what makes the decision right is what's actually where it was. So in this case, this is why it's only 50% correct or 50% incorrect. So what makes it right is where it was actually sampled from which one of those distributions. So this is why the overall percentage correct is only 80%, but not 20%. And this task is has been used a lot in signal detection theory when people were also interested to measure the uncertainty of the decision itself. And this is why they're also inserting uncertainty to the decision, not only to the sensory information. So this is relying on previous studies that have done that, including studies by Wejima and other investigation, also including some studies that use different type of stimuli, including in sound and so forth. So you still need to be able to correctly detect the orientation or to in order to perform the task at the level, for example, of 80%. So the fact that there are areas that are kind of can be ambivalent or ambiguous doesn't make it and doesn't take away the element of perception in that task, because there are cases when you actually need to clearly and distinguish the orientation of the target to perform the task at a certain level.
Thanks. Can I have another question?
Sure.
This is about, it's a more technical one, and this is about variability and the size of the population and the characterization. I mean, there's almost, well, I mean, these are very large populations. These are for the two experiments together, or in each experiment there were 54 participants with ASD and 90
so this is a total, and for each experiment it was about 30 or something from each group. There was a little bit more NT because there were the ASD, some of them were performing more in the same experiments. But yeah, so the overall for each experiment there were I don't have the number here exactly for each one of them, but it was a little bit less than 54 for the total.
And there were many more, and the number of controls was much larger?
The number of control was a little bit larger because some of the control did not came back to do the experiment. They just perform either 1 or 2 sessions.
You mean for a given experiment, the number of control and the number of ASD participants was similar?
Was about the same, yeah. Maybe a little bit more for the control, but not much.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Amit, if I can go back to just the question I had before with respect to potential differences in contrast sensitivity functions. So you used the same frequency, the same Gabor frequency in all experiments, only modulating the contrast level?
We modulate the contrast level, we vary the phase randomly, but we use the same spatial frequency.
Okay, so now I want to ask, do you think and I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it looks to me like kind of like high spatial frequency at least from the presentation. And I wonder if you think if you would have used a different spatial frequency, I don't know, lower spatial frequency, do you think the results would have been similar? I mean, do you think the results may be dependent on this, or do you think this? Yeah, that's mainly the question that I have. I mean, if the ASDs are sensitive to very low level, local types of information, maybe they will be more sensitive. Maybe they will be less sensitive to lower spatial frequencies. I'm just asking. I don't know, but
I don't know. I mean, we presented it at the center, so perhaps there are some variation that we will find with lower spatial frequency. I can see your point in terms, and you're saying that because they're more like traditionally they were associated with the details, and therefore if you use maybe lower spatial frequency, the performance will change. It's an interesting question.
I mean,
people vary in a systematic way the spatial frequency and tested whether the contrast sensitivity vary as a function of spatial frequency.
I'm just thinking that low spatial frequency is usually more related to global
Right.
types of information and high spatial frequency to more local types of information. That's why I'm just thinking about
Yeah,
that aspect.
I don't know if it was compared in a very systematic and rigorous way, different spatial frequencies.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Can I
Yoram
ask-
has a question. I see,
Yeah,
yes.
so very nice work.
Thanks.
First, I just wonder, so the bottom line is that there was the main thing was no difference within group, but I wonder if you did find some superior people or individuals, perhaps in the autistic group, that stood out, like superior performance. And
Interesting. Yeah, we kind of now trying to look more kind of individual differences. We didn't find we correlate the non-autistic population with AQ, and we didn't find any correlation with AQ. For like criterion shift as a function of AQ, autistic traits in non-autistic populations. But it would be interesting to see, yeah, whether you have some people who are very extreme in there, or do some maybe cluster
autistic group, especially.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of data, enough participant for that, but definitely more thing that we can look at the individual level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Amit, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I want to invite everybody to give the guy a big applause. And thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I hope we will see you all again after Passover if everything is close to normal. It's very difficult to say. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.